Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to this session on patient engagement and development. I have to say I'm in awe of the distinguished faculty that are up here today with me. This was an idea that came up last year, realizing the importance of the patient voice in development, whether it be pharmaceutical device or new technologies that are coming out every single day. And we wanted to make sure that we understood clearly the value of that patient voice throughout the development process. So with the help of a number of my colleagues on this panel, we were able to put this distinguished group together. And I want to share with you kind of how the morning is going to progress here. We're first going to hear from Molly White with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation about their focus in patient development and all the great partnerships that they've developed. Then hear from Sonia from the Epilepsy Foundation about how they're trying to bring to life the patient voice throughout the pipeline, discovery to market. And then Michelle from the FDA, who has graced us with her time to talk about all this initiative that's been going on with the FDA to bring patient science and engagement to the forefront of what FDA does. And Amy, who works for PPD now, but certainly spent a large portion of her life in industry, is going to talk about how industry throughout the years has been trying to bring the patient voice to development. And then Rose, who works for PPD too, about the work that they've been doing in their partnership with industries and patients to make sure that the protocols and the development programs that they're doing is really robust and bringing that voice to reality. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers first, just to give you a background. Molly White comes to us from San Francisco area, so made a big trip across country to be here today. The Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation has really done a great job with, I think, living their mission of care and cure. The organization has brought to reality here this patient voice and have a wonderful publication, if you have a chance to read it, on the voice of the patient and the work that they've done with the FDA. So I know she's going to talk more about it, but Molly brings this very unique background to the table here in terms of she has worked both in the private and the public sector and really knows how to bring groups of people together to make things happen. And while this is a really rare disease, I think they've made some of the greatest progress in terms of moving this agenda forward. But as you see, I mean, she's worked for Gap and Nike, along with, a number of health initiatives such as Artists for AIDS, the Ford Foundation, et cetera. And I think we have a lot to learn from her organization and what they've done. Sonia, I've known for quite a while with the Epilepsy Foundation. She's the Senior Director of Innovation. The foundation has really taken a huge leap in terms of how they're bringing together the patient voice and what they do. Their mission, of course, is to overcome the challenges of living with epilepsy and accelerating therapies to not just stop seizures, but find cures and save lives. They've done some really unique things with the We Prefer platform that she was instrumental in pulling together and developing, and this patient survey, My Seizure Gauge prototype device, which she's going to share with us today. But I think, again, cutting edge work that they're doing in this area that Sonia's going to share with us. And then Michelle, we're just so honored to have her here. This woman has done so much in terms of bringing this idea of patient science and engagement to the forefront. She's with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Her background is in ophthalmology, and I've asked her to share with us some of the learnings that they have in ophthalmology that we could apply maybe here in the neurosciences. She's also done a great job in terms of integrating the patient perspective throughout the life cycles of devices. and device technology that's being made more and more available to patients to manage and monitor their conditions. She also leads the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee and all their efforts at the FDA. So we'll hear more from her about the exciting work that the FDA is doing. And then Amy, who's on the board here of ASENT, she's a VP of neuroscience at PPD, but has spent 25 of her years in clinical development through the whole cycles of life cycle development, from concept to bringing a product to market. Very instrumental in bringing some really profound drugs to the market for patients. She now works for PPD, but also I thought was very, very interesting, she's become certified in lifestyle medicine, which of course is something I think that we're really all thinking about in this context too, and does do volunteer work in her neighborhood community health. So, and then Rose, our final speaker, but not the least in any way, shape, or form. She works for PPD too, very important in the strategic input and oversight of that portfolio. She has a background in obstetrics and gynecology, a very prominent experience in women's health. And I think what also she brings to the table today for all of us to think about is how do we increase minority participation and awareness in clinical trials, which I think is a huge gap and need of how do we bring these patients to the table to help us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to start. So if you could bring her slides up, that'd be great.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a very gracious introduction. When we first started talking about this panel, we talked about 7 to 8 minute presentations. So I'm going to romp through this presentation, and then I'm happy to answer any questions or address any additional topics that I didn't cover here. This whole idea of patient-focused drug development is a very interesting one for us because, especially when you have small heterogeneous patient populations and rare diseases like myotonic dystrophy, the idea of basing treatment assessments on primary endpoints is really not very effective, and we've certainly seen that in the drug development pipeline for myotonic dystrophy, and I think a lot of rare diseases have seen that. In general, there's a lot fewer drug development tools for diseases like this. There are no established endpoints and biomarkers. Trial design can be very, very tricky. This is a very heterogeneous, variable, and slow progressing disease. So it's very tricky to design a trial within a reasonable amount of time that's going to show clinical benefit. So you really need other data sets for diseases like this, and I think that's where this notion of patient voice and patient experience becomes really compelling. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of myotonic dystrophy. There's a type 1 and a type 2. It's essentially the same genetic repeat on 2 different chromosomes. There's also a congenital phenotype, which you can see in that little baby there. It's a very kind of late blooming disease. The organization itself is only about 12 years old. The first mutation was discovered in the late 1990s. The second mutation was discovered in the early 2000s. It's, as I said, slow progressing. It's very multisystemic. It affects every system in your body. It also affects the CNS. It's very poorly understood, and it's often misdiagnosed. And when you see that prevalence number of 1 in 2,500, you all know that that's basically the rare, non-rare breakpoint. And we have been told by the World Health Organization and NIH and others that the disease's prevalence is anywhere from 1 in 8,000 to 1 in 20,000. So we did a population-based prevalence study with newborn blood spots that we pulled out of the state of New York. We've run 70,000 spots for DM1 and DM2, pre-mutation and mutation, and DM1 is coming in really solidly at 1 in 2,500. So it's spectacular how prevalent this disease is around the world, and it's also spectacular how misdiagnosed and undiagnosed it is. These prevalence numbers are actually very interesting in terms of policy development, newborn screening opportunities, and lots of diagnostic odyssey projects. So a little bit about that. You can understand why then, if it's underdiagnosed, if people aren't getting diagnosed, and it's this misunderstood, And it's also this slow progressing and variable why designing a trial and figuring out therapies would be tricky. A little bit about the foundation. So our mission, like so many, is care and a cure. We have a whole care side. We developed the first clinical care guidelines for this disease and published them in neurology last year. We have clinical guidelines for DM2 and for congenital coming in the next couple of months. They've been accepted for publication. We also have special guidelines for respiratory and cardiac coming. We have a warm line, we have newsletters, we have an annual conference that grows every year. There's a lot that we do. We have support groups internationally. We do a tremendous amount to support people living with this disease because it's so misunderstood. People cannot find care, and they have a hard time dealing with the isolation that this disease creates. And then we have a pretty significant push on the cure side. We launched a 3-year initiative called MDF 3.0 that was a $6 million effort to accelerate drug development. And I won't drag you through every single bullet on there, but I did highlight the regulatory piece because we looked at the pipeline from basic science through to the payer environment, which is what we're still doing. And we looked at where we needed to either accelerate work and create work or eliminate barriers. And we ended up doing a pretty broad array of tool development and initiative launch addressing drug development. And the great news about that is we had 1 or 2 companies considering drug development for myotonic dystrophy in 2012, and the pipeline right now of people either looking at the disease and or actively developing products for the disease is now over 35. So it's been a pretty significant acceleration in the last few years, and it's obviously because of the tremendous activity in our academic and industry space, as well as some of the kind of work that we've done. So on the regulatory side, I will say that a lot of the work that we've done has been at the invitation or request of industry. We've really worked with industry partners to understand what we needed to do to lower risk for development in this disease. So we pulled together a full-day meeting in 2015 that was really meant to help industry and academic labs understand where we were with biomarkers, endpoints, and clinical trial design, because there had been no trials. And people were really struggling with how you could do any kind of measurement in about a year for a disease that doesn't change that much with a lot of the population. I will say, just in terms of, in order to ensure that we all have sort of unique information to share, I'm going to focus mostly on our PFDD meeting. I will tell you, we learned a lot out of this meeting working with FDA, and some of the things that we realized are it's incredibly important to hold the meeting very close to the FDA headquarters. It's important to work across the spectrum of teams at FDA, depending on who it is you're trying to attract, and to be diligent. But we did end up inviting the endpoint validation group, neurology review division attended, biomarkers and whatnot, and we published a report out of that meeting in Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. Following up on that meeting, we were asked to consider a PFDD meeting, and there had only been, at that point, FDA-sponsored PFDD meetings. So we went to Janet and said that we wanted to do the first externally focused PFDD meeting. We wrote a letter of inquiry, and we were approved. We've been holding these meetings at the annual conference that we host every year, because it allows us to bring in around 150 industry and academic professionals, as well as 350 to 400 patients. So it's a really nice bringing together of the people we want in the meeting in the first place. We had about 50% industry and academia participating in this meeting, and we had about half patients and families. I would say that the key learnings in terms of planning and development for that meeting were, it is really important to work, so the group at FDA that sponsors this program is called the Office of Strategic Programs. Once the meeting is approved, it's really important to reach out to the patient liaison groups, and we're going to hear a little bit about that later. They can be really helpful in terms of working through FDA. When you try to find things on the FDA website, FDA personnel will tell you often that they have to Google it to find it themselves. It can be kind of a labyrinth, and one of the things we learned is that it's really good to find the patient liaison groups at FDA and have them help you make your way through. It's important to be really persistent, and it's important to be clear on what you want to get out of this meeting. It's really helpful to talk to other groups that have done these meetings, because they have a lot of learnings and they can share them. And you won't always hear about that in presentations like this. And then in terms of the actual meeting itself, so it was held in College Park. We followed the FDA format, which I think is important. FDA worked really hard to come up with this PFDD approach, and they have very specific questions that they want answered. That's what you're trying to get them, is the answers to those questions. And they focus on the burden of disease and clinically meaningful benefit and definition of clinically meaningful benefit. So we basically followed their format to the letter, and I think that was a really good idea because it's a good process, and it also allows you to develop a voice of the patient report that is the kind of report that they want to see. We had panelists. Representing the different genotypes and phenotypes for this disease because we wanted to offer the broadest sort of perspective for FDA as possible. And we did something that I don't think had happened up to that point, which was we had people write their remarks. They had to be 5 minutes, and then we had them practice them on conference calls with us. So they had scripted remarks. We made sure that the remarks were not all the same thing, and we had them practice them 2 or 3 times on the phone so that they actually got them down to 5 minutes. And that allowed us not only to make sure that what they heard when they presented was really thoughtful, well-presented remarks that were from a variety of vantage points, but it also allowed us to develop moderator questions for the moderator to then take to the full audience that fleshed out the content that was presented from the panelists. So by doing that, we were able to have really tight, intelligent, thoughtful presentations from the panelists, and then we were able to ensure that what came out of the moderated discussion covered the rest of the key points that we felt were important for the disease. We had live and remote polling, which I think was also very important. It allowed people that were not able to attend to participate live, and it also allowed real-time reporting up on the screen so people could see exactly what the broader group was saying about disease burden, phenotype, clinically meaningful benefit, and so forth. We also built a 5-minute video, and we actually had a videographer go around the country and interview patients that were never going to be in a place where they could come to a conference like this about what it was like to not be able to talk, to not be able to be on the phone, to not be able to travel because of your GI symptoms, to have brain fog and not be able to stay in the world of work and so forth. So we were actually admonished not to show that film, and afterwards Billy Dunn said, you know, that was an incredibly important part of the process, and it really helped describe this disease for us in a way that we didn't understand. Myotonic dystrophy is put in that bucket of muscular dystrophy, so it's one of 9 muscle-related diseases, but it's incredibly different, as you all know, from limb-girdle, from Duchenne, from facial scapulohumeral dystrophy. And it's important when you're going to be looking at potential therapies for a disease like this that you understand this disease as myotonic dystrophy, not muscular dystrophy. So things like that video were very helpful, and we've actually had industry use it in investor presentations and presentations to senior management. It turned out to be a very good investment. We also had a science writer capture the proceedings and write them up for the Voice of the Patient report, and that is now on the FDA website as well as our website. I think in terms of outcomes, we have a far more sophisticated understanding of disease phenotypes and disease burden, both in terms of industry and academia that attended and FDA. And that is a very important distinction for us. We were able to gather data on disease burden, phenotypes, meaningful therapeutic approaches, and impacts. And this has really helped drive identification of endpoints, preclinical drug development. It's helped address this issue of how you design a trial. So given the fact that we've had a real dearth of natural history data and prior trials in this space, this has been really useful information. It's been very helpful to have this captured in a way that is appropriate to FDA on their website. It's really helped us develop relationships with FDA that have been very helpful to us and to industry. We've had a number of conversations with CDER. We've had a number of conversations with CBER, and it also helps us launch into EMA as we move internationally. It's very important to us that this document was included in the benefit risk framework, and we also did a benefit risk study with Silicon Valley Research Group that was attached to the Voice of the Patient report and as addendum. Anything you can do to influence that benefit risk framework is incredibly important, and we were very focused on ensuring that that happened through this experience. And then the last thing I would say is this was an incredibly powerful opportunity for patients. People want to talk about how it feels to live with a disease like this, and they want to talk about what they want to see from therapies. And we had such a powerful response to this, this meeting that we have followed up with very, very similar meeting formats for CNS targeting therapies and for on the issue of progression. And we have publications coming on both of those. We've been asked, particularly on the CNS front, to get that information out as soon as possible. And we have one this year on experiencing the disease over 50. So, I would say, in summary, the PFDD process was an incredibly powerful process for our patient community. It's been incredibly helpful to industry. And I think it's a really potentially strategic opportunity for patient groups that are thinking about bringing patient voice to drug development. Thank you.
We're going to have each of the presenters present, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So, as I was introduced, I am with the Epilepsy Foundation, and I'm also going to keep it fairly short and just give teasers about things that I'm happy to take a deeper dive into in the panel discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So when I think about engagement along the clinical pipeline, I think about 3 different areas in which a nonprofit organization or the community can really step up to be involved in the R&D process. The first is in guiding discovery, which, identifying unmet needs or prioritizing what matters most. The second is in the clinical trials, really thinking through what the endpoints could be. So, for example, in the epilepsy community, we always talk about seizures, but there are other endpoints that are important, especially when you're going into some of the rare epilepsy categories, and also defining performance goals, in terms of what the effect size should actually be. And then when we think about regulatory or payer issues, that's where we can start assessing these benefit-risk trade-offs. How does this new therapy compare to other options? So what I'm going to do in this talk is just give an example of how we're working in each of these 3 areas. So in terms of guiding discovery, one of the programs that I oversee is the Epilepsy Innovation Institute. It's a high-risk incubator that tackles challenges in the community. And what we did was we asked our community, what do you want us to tackle? We own epilepsy.com, which allows us to survey the community fairly readily. And so in a month, over 1,000 people responded. And it was really wide-ranging in terms of where they were. There were at least one person from every state, as well as internationally. And regardless of seizure frequency, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, or less than a year, one of the biggest aspects of epilepsy that people wrote about was unpredictability, not knowing when or where the seizure was going to happen. And that's why we decided to launch the My Seizure Gauge initiative. And one of the powers of doing an initiative like this is that in terms of, as a nonprofit, getting the fundraising, getting investors on board, we were able to raise the funds fairly quickly because we had the community behind us, and they were really excited about the approach that we took. So we then hosted an innovation workshop where we had people in the community along with researchers both inside and outside the community talking about what could be possible, and decided that we wanted to move forward with creating a seizure forecasting device. So thinking about what parameters in the world of parameters that are out there that would allow us to create an algorithm to identify when someone might be at high risk or low risk of having a seizure. And I'm going to get back to this a little bit later. Another example is the voice in clinical trials. So one of the things that the Epilepsy Foundation does, and we do this modeled after the Alzheimer's disease community, is we host a research roundtable where we bring people impacted by epilepsy along with the FDA and the European counterpart, the EMA, with companies. This past year we had 27 companies at the table and clinicians to talk about issues and regulatory roadblock development. So for example, in 2016, we started by discussing reducing placebo exposure. An issue in the epilepsy community is thinking about that placebo arm. So if you have uncontrolled seizures, you are at risk of SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And when you are in the placebo arm of a trial, regardless of whether the seizure frequency hasn't changed or someone's gotten worse, you're supposed to stay in a regimented treatment that's unchanged. And ethically, that raises a lot of questions about whether or not that's best for the patient. There was a meta-analysis done, and it showed that people in a placebo arm are actually at higher risk of dying from SUDEP. So we had that research roundtable to really bring that issue to the forefront and discussed different clinical trial designs. And based on those discussions, there was a white paper that was published in Neurology. UCB, one of the epilepsy companies, is now testing out one of those clinical trial designs that was discussed at that meeting. And so that's an example of how being able to do that has been really impactful. In 2017, we talked about pediatric clinical trials, thinking about what data can be used to extrapolate. In 2018, we started talking about evolving concepts and endpoints, so thinking about beyond the seizure, what can we use? In 2019, so just last week, we started talking about efficient clinical trials, really thinking about the risk-benefit of from the patient and caregiver perspective of giving someone to a clinical trial, and then just because I think about the seizure gauge and wearables on the device side, when do you actually want to use a device? I mean, it sounds really cool and it's tech fancy, but what is it actually giving you that you aren't getting already, and when should you be incorporating it? Similar to what was said in the last presentation, these need to be in DC if you want to get the FDA there, but it's been a really successful and rewarding experience to have all these different stakeholders at the table and involved in that conversation. And then in the third bucket, when we talk about regulatory issues, we decided that we wanted to create an engagement platform to improve healthcare policies, research, and care. And so what we created was the We Prefer program. It just launched last year, so it's still in early stages, and we decided to apply it to the My Seizure Gauge initiative. And one of the first things that we did was we set out guiding principles that I wanted to state just in case anyone else is interested about these types of community engagement platforms, because I think that the principles really highlight what we're going after. So number one, we believe that it's imperative to incorporate the perspectives of people impacted by epilepsy into drug and device development and regulatory review. Number two, we think that the notions of meaningful benefit and acceptable risk can differ depending on who you are, whether you're a researcher or a clinician, whether you're someone living with epilepsy or a care partner. Number three, there needs to be an infrastructure for the epilepsy community to have that active voice to help guide drug and device development and regulatory review. Four, all stakeholders deserve a voice in all stages, so we want to push the voice of the community, but we want to also make sure that all stakeholders are involved in that conversation. And five, whatever results or findings, interpretations that come out, they are a public good, and therefore it is imperative for us to also disseminate that information if we are to take this on. So, one of the things that we did was we started a collaboration with John Bridges as a consultant. He's a healthcare economist who has also worked with the FDA thinking about risk-benefit trade-offs in the device space. And we developed a survey to start thinking about the seizure forecasting device. So as I alluded to with the Seizure Gauge initiative, we're really interested in creating a forecasting algorithm. And so we started thinking through what are the attributes about the device and what do patients actually prefer to have in that device. And this is really critical because in 2010, there was a trial in Australia with Neurovista where they started creating a seizure advisory system. And there they implanted electrodes and followed individuals for 6 months to 18 months to try to see if they could create forecasting algorithms. Out of the 15 individuals, 4 people dropped out due to adverse events, but of the 11 that remained, they were actually able to create forecasting algorithms. So they got really excited and they came to the FDA. And the FDA, which I think makes sense, said we're not sure that we want to support this trial because 4 people dropped out. This isn't a treatment. Do people actually want this? And so the company went bankrupt. But the legend of Neurovista remains. And so what we decided to do is really think through how invasive are people willing to go? How would they want to wear this forecasting algorithm? What forecasting notifications would be useful? Or thinking about the cost, which isn't an FDA issue, but more of a payer issue and practicality. So we came up with different attributes using this community engagement platform to crowdsource what those attributes could be. We then developed 18 different hypothetical medical device profiles and asked individuals to choose what they thought was the best feature and worst feature of the device, as well as whether or not they would use it to understand the acceptability profiles. This manuscript has just been submitted, so hopefully it will be published soon. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was here down at the bottom was one of the devices that people liked the most. And it was a device that notified when someone was in the safe zone, so when someone was at a low chance of having a seizure. And often when you listen to talks talking about seizure forecasting, they're focused on the opposite. They're focused on when someone's at high risk. So this is just an example of the types of information that you can learn from doing surveys from the community about the end design and what we need to be thinking about. So I ran through all of this really quickly just to give you teasers of the types of different initiatives that were going on. I also wanted to point out that Tracy Dixon-Salazar there in the back, I think she did a fireside chat yesterday, has also been doing amazing work in the epilepsy community through Lennox Gastaut. So, you know, and thinking about how to incorporate their voice. And so if you don't have a chance to talk to her, you should if you want to get some insights there, since she's doing some other really cool stuff. And then the last thing that I wanted to conclude with is some things for discussion that I've been noticing. One is, I think that almost everyone would say that the patient voice is important. It's something that we don't really need to debate, but I think that what is really unclear is how to incorporate that voice. So I hear the science of patient input. I think it's important. I like the phrase. I don't really understand what that science is. I think we're still in early stages of that, and I think it's important to recognize that as we move forward. I also think that as I talk to a lot of companies and startups who are really excited about the patient preference and movement and want to get involved, that there becomes a blurred line where I realize they really want me to do their marketing research. They want the focus group. They want to know how to promote their specific product. And I think that that is something that, as a company, you need to keep in mind, and as an advocacy organization, to really set the lines of when that line gets blurred, because we need to have clear expectations at the outset. And the third thing that I wanted to bring up is there is a financial and time burden component to these types of studies. You might think that a survey seems really easy, you just release it if you have the platform, for example, on epilepsy.com. But for me, for example, we had to hire a consultant, right? We wanted to go through the IRB approval process. All of that takes time and money. And you know, hopefully you're going to have a lot of companies in your space. So which companies do you assist? What topics do you take? How do you prioritize? And so those are huge barriers to entry, and something that maybe later on in the discussion we can talk about. Thank you.
We're going to hear from Michelle next.
So good morning. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I wanted to say that Sonia perfectly queued me up, because I'm going to address some of those questions that she talked about. I want to talk about what patient science and engagement is about at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Patients are at the heart of what we do, and in fact, it's reflected in our vision statement that we want to help ensure that patients have access to high-quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And part of this mission and vision that we have is embedded in what our mandate is. We're here to help the public. We've seen an evolution in the healthcare system from a very provider-driven system and regulator-driven system to one of more shared decision-making. We are integrating patients into our regulatory activities as well as into the healthcare ecosystem. And I think this has come about because patients are interfacing with devices themselves at home. They have diabetic machines that are monitoring their glucose. They have infusion pumps. They have pacemakers that they are downloading information into their providers. So they are more empowered and care more about the nuances of their device than ever before. They're also more involved in shared decision making. There's a lot of information available at your fingertips, and that allows you to make more informed decisions and engage in a meaningful conversation with your healthcare provider. They're also communicating and connecting with one another. They're sharing their experiences, the symptoms and side effects they have with the therapeutics. And they're also providing support to one another, which leads to empowerment. And through empowerment has come organization. A lot of patient groups, as you've heard from both Molly and Sonia, are working to create patient-led efforts. Disease registries is one of the big things that we're seeing happening in a lot of patient organizations that can help facilitate clinical trials. They're also training patient advisors to sit on development boards for industry and help design studies that not only are more patient-friendly, but also are collecting outcomes that are meaningful to the patient. And we've seen reports that has led to increased efficiency in trial conduct. So I want to talk a little bit about definitions before we start launching into how patient input has affected our regulatory efforts. And I want to start with the definition of patient engagement. There are a lot of definitions out there, but the ones that CDRH is embracing right now is intentional, meaningful interactions with patients that provide opportunities for mutual learning and effective collaborations across the total product life cycle. And when we're talking about the total product life cycle, I'll show you in subsequent slides, but it really is from the design and ideation phase of a medical device all the way through to the post-market surveillance for that device. It's only with meaningful patient engagement that we create robust scientific assessment of patient input. And patient input we look at as two different things. One is patient-reported outcomes, and the other is patient preferences. Patient-reported outcomes are any report of the status of a patient's health that comes directly from the patient without interpretation from anyone else. It is not the observer's report, it's not a care partner's report, it is directly from the patient. Patient preferences differ because they really are looking at the value of things for patients. So patients may look at the value of a benefit of a medical intervention, compare it to the risk of that medical intervention, and decide how they may make those trade-offs. They may also rank each of those, and that will inform our regulatory efforts. So these are the different ways that we've seen it integrated into regulatory submissions. You probably heard it this morning if you were in Carlos Pena's talk about how they are endpoints in pre-market studies as well as in post-market studies. So this may be things, how are patients functioning? How are they feeling? What symptoms may they be experiencing? And they're aggregated in a way that we can analyze them and understand them. We're also seeing greater integration of patient-reported outcome measures in clinical care. Many of us, when we go see our providers, they're giving us assessments of our depression and anxiety levels, how well we sleep, our function. All of that is being integrated into electronic health records. And that is important because as we are moving as an agency towards the utilization of real-world data in our decision-making, the richness and the robustness of data in the electronic health record will be critical. We're also focusing not just on patient-reported outcomes, but outcomes that matter to patients, and they are not synonymous. So we are encouraging industry to consider what do patients care about and measure that in their studies as well. Patient preference information is different. It tells us, as I alluded to before, the value of the outcomes to patients. And the way that we've seen it used in some of our studies, and we've had about 15 patient preference studies conducted by industry so far that have been informing our decision-making process, but it can tell us the effect size. And in essence, what amount of benefit do you need to see for it to be clinically meaningful to a patient? It may also help us understand the uncertainty that patients are willing to experience. For example, if you have a high-risk device, potentially, but no other options available to treat that patient population, and the disease is extremely debilitating, the uncertainty that they may be willing to tolerate may differ from a disease that doesn't have the same level of incapacitation for the patients. We use them often in our benefit risk assessments, as well as considering what subgroup may potentially derive benefit compared to the larger group. We did an obesity study a few years ago, and the obesity study was looking at, the review division had a certain amount of weight loss that they thought needed to happen in order for the risk of mortality and repeat surgeries would be appropriate. Well, when they did the patient preference study, they found out that patients were willing to accept a much lower amount of weight loss for some of those risks. And that informed the decision to approve that device. So we do take that into consideration. So as I alluded to, patient input's critical across the total product life cycle. We have heard sponsors who have talked to patients in the discovery phase to figure what aspect of the patient's symptoms should they address in their development pipeline. We also see it in the investigation as well as in the post-market surveillance. And that post-market phase leads to updates or modifications or expansion of the medical device labeling. We have provided, as an agency, guidance for how you develop these measures. There's the patient-reported outcome measure guidance that was developed in 2009, and it's being updated, which I'll allude to in a moment, and the patient preference information guidance that was published in 2016. So both of these documents are available to inform you for what the agency is looking for as you're developing these measures. And this is available to the public, patient organizations, industry, as well as academic researchers. We also have incorporated this information across our benefit risk frameworks, not only in the investigational phase, but also when you're submitting it to us, as well as when it's on the market already in the compliance arena. So we are considering patient perspectives across the entire product development cycle. I want to allude to a little bit the patient-focused drug development efforts. We work very collaboratively at the FDA across the different centers, and you've heard from Molly about the patient-focused drug development meetings. They're actually evolving now. They're being called the patient-focused medical product development meetings, because we're seeing a lot of crossover in devices, biologics, and drugs, and there's combination of products that are coming also to treat a lot of these conditions. So you will often see on many of these panels that there's a little bit more centers being represented than there had been in the past. And patient organizations are requesting multiple centers because they have insight into what's in the development pipeline. So there was a guidance about how you hold these so that you can provide the most meaningful input to FDA. There's guidance 2 and 3 that we had a workshop for last fall, and there will be posting hopefully in the next few years. These are guidances that tell you not only patient-reported outcomes, but clinical outcome assessments, things like the 6-minute walk test, I think. Is it 6 or 5? I don't know. It's some minute walk test. Or it's 6. That's what I was right. So 6-minute walk test. There's anything that may be a performance-based measure, a clinician-reported outcome, and what we call observer-reported outcomes. So those are different than proxy outcomes. We do not like proxy outcomes because we don't believe any one person can suppose how another individual feels. But we do know that somebody who lives with a patient can observe behaviors and report those to us, and they can be very useful. So that's what that guidance will focus on. And then there are a couple more in the works, and I don't know how many of you were able to attend the city meeting that was held on March 18th, where we really did discuss how do we enhance patient input on clinical trials across the entire clinical trial process, even to the post-trial phase. I want to talk a little bit, now we've talked about general science, I want to talk about what our center has done in terms of engagement. We put a charge out to our staff that it was important for them to engage with patients because a lot of our staff are engineers, they're chemists, they're toxicologists. They may never have interfaced with a patient unless they lived in their family. And so we thought it was important that they heard from the patients who were using or would be using the devices that they were reviewing. And so we required 90% of our staff to interact with patients during that time course, and we exceeded that. We had 96% of our staff having a meaningful interaction with patients, and they defined what they wanted to hear. So they told us the topics, and they were very actively involved in the discussions with patients who came to talk to us at the center. These were closed meetings at the center where patients shared their experience living with the device and with the condition. We also established the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. This committee is unlike any other at FDA. It is comprised solely of patients, caregivers, and patient advocates. They are charged with providing the highest level of recommendations that they could possibly provide to FDA, because an advisory committee is the most formal and highest level of recommendations that we take from the public. They gave us insights on general matters, so they're not focusing on one specific device, but they're focusing on issues that touch many devices. And one thing I do want to emphasize, when I say patients, these are people who are living with the condition, but they are humans that have jobs and have employment in many different areas. So they're experts in legal matters, they're experts in software development, they're experts in communication, and they can provide very meaningful insights to us as we are deciding what to do as a center. So our first meeting was in October of 2017, and the question we asked was, how can patient input help in clinical investigations for medical devices? Based on the discussion we had at that meeting, we committed as a center to developing guidance on how patients' engagement can occur, because we heard that a large barrier was FDA. And so we wanted to debunk the myth. We wanted to show what you can do and how important it is to do it. And so we are working on this guidance document as we speak. The other thing I wanted to talk about, as I said, it's important to have patient engagement not only in the clinical trial design, but in all research that's going to touch the regulatory arena. And so what we did is we worked with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the FDA, obviously, Research Triangle Institute, MIT, and the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. And we put together a team to look at uncertainty. And the uncertainty we're focusing on is how much uncertainty are patients who have Parkinson's disease willing to accept, and not design your study just based on the standard 0.05 alpha threshold. We had patient scientists, that's what they dubbed themselves, and they called themselves patient scientists because they provided a lot of insight. They explained what it was like to live with the condition and their challenges with the therapies that were available. So it really did help bring the disease to life and brought to mind symptoms that we had not considered and were not previously included in our device trials. And how they did it is that they were integrated into the team. They sat at all the design meetings, they provided meaningful input into the survey tool, and they helped recruit patients and helped with the interpretation of the results. So they were included in all facets. They presented at scientific meetings, they came to the podium with us, and we thought that was critical because it really did show that their contribution improved the quality of the research that we did. The last thing I wanted to allude to is a mechanism that we wanted to put in place so that our staff could get input from patients at the right time. So when the medical device submission was in front of them, if they had questions about what's important to patients, if they had questions about what it's like to live with the condition, or what their experience has been interfacing with the device, they could get direct access to that patient group and get aggregated responses to questions they may have. And so we established a patient and caregiver connection. This connection, we currently have 4 partners. It's in a pilot stage, but you can see some of our partners touch a lot of different arenas because we believe that the caregiver, or the care partner as we like to call them, are important, as well as we've touched on some of the rare diseases and pediatric population because they're often overlooked, and we want to make sure that children's voices are also considered. So we know that the time is now. You've already heard about all the exciting work that the patient organizations are doing. They're being more involved in clinical trials. They're helping to generate real-world evidence. They're communicating on social media platforms and mobilizing that way. And they're investing resources into development of biomarkers, patient-reported outcome measures, patient preference studies. They are making an impact, and we want to help empower them to make an even greater impact, because we believe there's extreme benefit in hearing the patient's voice. It informs the device design and the clinical trials. It brings to light new considerations that we may not have previously integrated into our thinking on current issues. It can raise or confirm problems that may exist with specific devices, and it can communicate treatment preferences so that we may make more informed decisions when we're making those decisions and not relying on our own biases, but really taking into consideration the patient's perspective. And it may identify special populations that may be willing to tolerate different benefits and risk ratios for a given treatment. So I put this information up that if you have any questions about our PRO programs, our patient preference efforts, how we engage with patients, you can contact them. And if you just don't know, you can send me an email and I'll help direct you in the right way. So thank you very much.
Rose, you want to go next? Or Amy, go ahead. Go ahead, Amy.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to put on my lifestyle medicine hat and ask you all to stand up. Does anybody know the current recommendation on how long you should sit at any one time? 20 minutes. Yeah, so if you have an Apple Watch, you can set it so every 20 minutes you get buzzed and says time to stand. You may sit down. In the lifestyle medicine world, we say sitting is the new smoking. We sit way too much. So if you have the opportunity, get a standing desk and stand 20 minutes and sit one. Just turn it around. So I want to start out by saying my entire 25 and a half years in industry, I worked for the same company. I worked for Eli Lilly and Company. So my remarks apply to things we did at Lilly. I'm assuming that many of these things happen at all big pharma companies, but those of you in the room who have worked at other pharma companies can tell me if that's the case. When I first started there, I was pretty early in my career, and I went with all sorts of misgivings about things I wouldn't want to leave behind in academia. And about halfway through my full day of interviews at Lilly, I thought, oh, I'm not sure I'm qualified for this job, because I was seeing people representing disciplines that I knew nothing about. And finally, I talked to a physician who said, look, they're not hiring you for your statistical, your marketing, or your business acumen. Basically, well, I wouldn't have been hired if that had been the case. They're hiring you for your medical and your therapeutic expertise. And I soon realized that I took the job. That was a big reason why, talking to her. But I soon realized that one of my main roles was to educate people about the diseases for which we were trying to find drugs. If you think about it, we worked on cross-functional teams, and most of the team members were not medical people. So we had chemists, we had biologists, we had pharmacokineticists, we had patent attorneys, we had marketing people. As much as I tried to keep them off the team, they were on the team. So we had all these disciplines represented, and many of those people representing those disciplines had no knowledge of the diseases that we were studying. So I felt like it was my responsibility to educate them. And to that end, the medical group, when I started, had a mantra called "the patient is waiting." And we would often use that to, remind teams, because the drug development process is so long that it's easy to lose sight of the end goal. So we would use that mantra, "the patient is waiting." And then some of the ways that we used to educate our teams was to bring in patients. And I was fortunate enough, Lilly's about a mile from the Indiana University Medical Center. I had a part-time position there. So I would get patients from my colleagues at the university to come in, and I would interview them in front of our team. And we would ask them, what their main concerns were, what, they were looking for in a drug, and get as much information as we could, and get it directly from the patient, which is much more impactful than just my standing there telling them. I think the biggest learnings from me were when I spent a lot of my career in early drug development, where the patient is even farther down the road. But I did spend 4 years on the Cymbalta team, and I was responsible for the development of Cymbalta for fibromyalgia. And I don't know how much you know about fibromyalgia, but it's a disease that still lacks some credibility in some people's mind. Although now that we have some drugs approved, I think that the credibility has increased. But I quickly aligned myself with the founder of the Fibromyalgia Association, who also happened to be a patient. And she educated me a lot. The first thing she said is, because we started out calling it fibromyalgia syndrome, and we even had, of course, you have to have an acronym, FMS, and all of our documents, everything, all of our notes, FMS. And she said, fibromyalgia patients really don't like the syndrome designation because it makes it sound like it's not a real disease. And I said, well, what would you prefer? And she said, just fibromyalgia. So I spent months going through documents and changing FMS to FM. And I think we were successful because the indication we got was for the treatment of fibromyalgia, not for fibromyalgia syndrome. And I rarely hear syndrome anymore. But that was a direct result of my interaction with a patient. The other thing I learned is that, as Sonia said with the epilepsy questionnaire, I found that fascinating, that what patients wanted was probably different from what your preconceived idea of what they wanted was. And boy, did we find that out with fibromyalgia. Dr. Robert Bennett, who is a rheumatologist in the Northwest and a fibromyalgia expert, did a survey in preparation for an FDA meeting a few years ago. And although the hallmark of fibromyalgia is chronic widespread pain, that was pain was the fourth symptom the patients listed as being the most impairing to them. They listed morning stiffness, which physicians hadn't even listed on their list of symptoms in fibromyalgia. Morning stiffness, fatigue, and non-restorative sleep before pain. It just demonstrated to me that we often have advisory boards that are comprised of disease experts, but who's better expert in the disease than the patient? So we really need to get more patient involvement and patient interaction. I have lots more examples, but I don't want to take any more time, and I can maybe share those during the feedback or during the question and answer session.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Nancy and ASENT. I'll back up a little bit and tell how I connected with Dr. Tarver and Dr. Chappell, Amy and Michelle for this conference at PPD, and I've been in the global CRO world for now 15 years. I left medical practice. I was a practicing OBGYN. I was a PI in practice and transitioned to industry in the on the CRO side 15 years ago. And since I've been in 2 CROs, so before PPD, 10 years in one, and in the last few years at PPD. And we have a physician group that meets quarterly, Amy, myself, and probably 10 or 12 others. And we were talking about topics for the next time. And I said, well, maybe we have a new patient engagement work stream or working group at PPD. So I've been on it for about a year. I said, well, maybe I'll update the group on that. And then Amy said, oh, that'd be great because, this conference is coming up, and we got to talking. And then I met Michelle Tarver because I was appointed to the FDA Patient Engagement Advisory Committee and sat on the inaugural meeting panel in October of 2017. So I thought she would be a great fit. So it's amazing how things work out. So today I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to hopefully explain for those who don't know. And before I joined the CRO, I had never heard of a CRO, and I didn't really understand how they worked or where they fit in, the environment of drug development. I obviously understood what pharmaceutical companies did, or so I thought. So just to back up a little bit, and if this is obvious information, I apologize, but I think it's important to understand how CROs work. So the CROs are contract research organizations. Our clients are pharmaceutical companies. We work a bit with some government entities, so we do some work with, a little bit of work with DOD and NIH, but for the most part, it's pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device companies. And overall, CROs employ, over 100,000 people all over the world, over 100 countries. And the different companies have grown twofold since 2008. So like industry works, CROs have also evolved a bit. We have functional groups that cover every aspect of drug development, so biostatistics, project management, medical and therapeutic expertise, regulatory experts, statisticians, you name it, clinical team, everything. And we have worked, PPD and other companies work with all of the top pharmaceutical companies and over 750 biotech companies. So I put that on top because it kind of sums up kind of where we are quietly working as partners to pharmaceutical companies. And I'll describe a bit more how we engage with patient groups and the government as well. So, you know, in our milieu, our stakeholders are obviously pharmaceutical companies as our clients and partners, individual patient stakeholders, researchers, and patient advocacy groups. And our patient-centered evidence is gathered from pulling from all of these parts of industry. As we've talked about, this is the era, long time coming, for patient-focused drug development. We have all of the regulatory backing and impetus from this in the U.S., but also PPD and a lot of CROs are also global, like pharmaceutical company. So we, you know, work closely with the EMEA and other, you know, Health Canada, the Asia Pac regulatory agents as well, and you know, FDA and EMEA have a formal patient engagement cluster, but that's going to broaden into some of the other regulatory regions as well. And then we have on the patient front, advocacy group relationships, which we're developing and thinking about differently. One of the things Nancy wanted me to focus on, I'm also involved with National Medical Association, which is the African American Medical Association, and we have an initiative called Project Impact, which is involving minorities in clinical, minority patients in clinical trials. So I'm a medical advisor to that. I'm also on the NAACP National Health Committee, been on that for probably 20 years. So in those groups, I work with advocacy groups across the spectrum of health. So the Sickle Cell Foundation's a recent focus for NAACP, for example, but we've also worked with the American Heart Association and other patient and disease organizations to really work with bringing the patient voice into advocacy as well as into drug development. So that's one example. In PPD, on the patient engagement work stream that I'm in, recently we also launched a company-wide survey to see what our employees, what advocacy groups they might be involved in. If they're a parent with a child with a rare disease, if they're involved in, you know, advocacy as a volunteer. So we did that and we collected the information. This is very recent. And then our decision is now, okay, now that we know that we have a lot of people working in different areas of advocacy and different disease organizations, what are we going to do with that information? Because we know, you know, we have about 20,000 people globally, and we got a huge response. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do with this? We have some alliances through oncology and rare diseases that are obvious, but now that we found that, you know, there are people that, you know, are volunteers in their communities, you know, what can we do? How can we leverage that better? And then obviously we work with all types of pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotechnology companies, and it's interesting from that perspective to see where, how companies incorporate the patient voice. I've worked with some companies where they've called in, had a day of focus just on patient engagement, and they had sites, they had obviously medical experts, they've had patients, and we just kind of drilled down on how they can do it better, how can they do it differently. Some companies are more ahead than others, and some deal with it differently. I've worked with small companies that had a day, for example, with a company that works in MS, and they had a day where they invited in minority providers for MS patients, and just a whole day of talking about the differences in how MS manifests across gender as well as across different races. So different companies are putting patient engagement in different areas. Some have it in marketing, some have it in R&D, and some have it in kind of the corporate office. So it's interesting to see how companies address this differently. A lot of companies are starting to have a patient advocacy group. Some companies have a chief patient officer. So they're addressing it on different levels. PPD as CRO of the day, we have a very cross-functional approach. Over the years, we've acquired patient outreach groups or patient advertising groups, Accurian, to come up with patient recruitment and retention campaigns. We bought that in-house. Synexus, which is formerly Radiant Research, is a network of research sites, different site models. So we have access or are partnered, or they're part of our company now. And then we have bought Evadera, which is a late phase group that does a lot of the patient preference data, health economic data. So there's a whole group of scientists that have worked across industry and health economics. They develop and validate ePros and have a series of publications and experts in pretty much every specialty. And then you have the PPD cross-functional groups globally, made up of pretty much every functional group needed for drug development. With all of this experience and kind of the different functional groups, we've probably touched on every medical specialty. We've worked with almost 300,000 sites across 120 countries. So our footprint is big, but we also use that information to help have built up this huge body of experience to help different clients. And all of that recently is trying to figure out different ways to drive the patient voice and protocol design. One of my favorite experiences recently has been to work with it was a European client that had a protocol synopsis, and they engaged us to develop an advisory board, but they wanted half of it to be patients and patient advocates and the usual scientific and medical experts. And they wanted it to be across different countries. They only wanted about 5 or 6 people, and they had specific questions about their protocols that they wanted, once the advisory board was convened, for the participants to answer. And sounded straightforward, and then we realized we hadn't really done this before. So it's easy to identify KOLs and people from the medical community. Some patient advocacy groups have a big online and social media presence, so it's easy to identify them. But when we started digging down to try to actually reach out, especially in Europe, we started running into a little interesting roadblocks. So language barriers, some of the websites were in different languages, so thank goodness for Google Translate. We also have, in most countries, we have a country office and we have a clinical team based in most countries. So we relied on them to help with translating, and once we found someone to contact, to be on the telephone, to just have a real-time conversation with them in their own language. Unlike a lot of places, especially a small patient advocacy organization, they may not even have a full-time staff, so trying to just get someone on the line was interesting, and then add the language barrier and so forth. So we actually found that to be a big learning experience, and then once the committee was convened, we had a patient that was also a patient advocate, we had a parent, we had a rehabilitation nurse, and we had some senior and junior faculty KOLs. And the answers to the questions were just amazing, because it was a rare urological condition. So how, even the differences regionally were interesting. You had patients that they wanted pediatric patients, but we asked, one of the questions asked, well, could the 18 to 21-year-old age be raised, because these patients were homebound and wheelchair bound, so they're living at home into their mid to late 20s, and their parents are their caretakers, and they're not going to school, or maybe they're being homeschooled. So could we raise that age, or at least have a arm of the trial that would address these mid-20 years, the millennials that are not necessarily pediatric, but they're functioning at home as pediatric patients. And then some of the medication administration issues were the concerns raised by the patients and the advocates were very different from the KOLs and the people treating the patients. So I think all the points mentioned today, having that input really made a big difference. It really made a better and robust protocol. And we're now, the report we sent to the company, resulted in them really adjusting their protocol, and hopefully the program will continue on into the later stages. But that's one example of kind of going off of script in developing these patient advocacy groups and bringing not just patients, but providers and different types of providers into the discussion. The other thing that we did that was, I think, a little bit different, and we had no frame of reference for, was, well, how do we reimburse them? Do we reimburse the patients differently from the KOLs? And as a practical point, we gave the same grant amount or stipend to everyone. So we didn't make a differential to, a mother who was one of our advisors or patient scientists, as we did, a senior academician expert in the field. So, those are the little things that also, you respect patients' time, you respect advocates' time, and value their input equally. And I thought the input from that standpoint was, just supremely worthwhile. So the other thing that we've done as a company, because we have access to the different expertises, we've developed and worked on validating different endpoints, focusing on early engagement of the patient in the protocol, as an example that I just gave, and then figuring out ways to optimize the protocol so that it makes sense in the real world. Drilling down on the eligibility criteria with the appropriate patient population. We draw on everyone's experience that's involved in the different projects. And then we have also in-house, and we refresh and reiterate all the time, how can we make these trials less burdensome for patients? How can we use e-recruitment, e-consent? What kind of adherence technologies? We work with a range of different vendors. We bring them in, and the other balance to this is we don't want to add a whole lot to a program, a proposal budget. So we have to really be conscious of telling a client, this is what we can do, but this is all extra. So in terms of what would make it realistic, especially for smaller companies. We have to be very budget sensitive, but we do access as much of this technology and offer it and demo it to different, from different vendors and different clients. And a lot of them, like some other companies that I mentioned, we've actually bought in-house. And then different CROs do this differently, but I think what we're seeing in the CRO industry is that people are bringing in these different companies in-house as partners, so they're not a separate vendor or a separate budget. And then working around endpoint collection, we have an initiative at PPD for figuring out virtual trials. It's one of our initiatives recently. Which trials in therapeutic areas can be best utilize virtual technology. So we have looked at how to leverage telemedicine, home health nursing, patient direct-to-patient clinical supplies, all of the wearables and devices, and then, and again, it's never going to be a one-size-fits all, but different technology applied to, everything that we can do to reduce the patient burden, but also bring the trial in quicker and more seamlessly get the best patients in. And then the question that I've seen come up in different patient advocacy settings is, well, what about the data? We participate in the trial and then we never hear about what happens to it, what was found out. So we have an initiative or kind of a work stream around data transparency to make sure that, to work with clients to make sure that the patients also receive the data in a format that they can interpret and understand. So they're, again, empowered by their participation in the trial. They'll speak more positively about being in clinical trials. This is very key in minority communities. A lot of minority communities in disease states like sickle cell or other indications, they get recruited for trials and then they never hear from the company again, or they never hear about the results. So one thing that I've seen consistently is that in some groups, or most patient advocacy groups, they want to be engaged around like disease education, not just, come hear about my trial, be in my trial, and that's all you hear. They want relationships with sponsor companies around the disease, around communicating the disease and understanding the disease, and they definitely want access to the results and helping not just here are the results, but what do these results mean? What's next? What's coming? How do I get access to this medication after the trial? And in designing and working with clients on trial design, where it's appropriate, the suggestion of, can they be in a long-term extension study after the initial treatment space, especially if the medication has been working or it's going to be expensive when it's available. And then to recognize and reward the contribution of patients, making sure that, again, nuts and bolts, but the patient budgets take into consideration, transportation, time on site, for a pediatric patient, the parent or the caregiver, the babysitter for the other kids, all those things that, generally don't always come up, but can make or break someone participating and having a good experience in a clinical trial. Through all of this kind of diligence and working around different therapeutic areas and different types of clients, we have a good sense of what motivates patients. And again, the advisory boards, separate patient panels, focus groups, some of these things we all discuss. Getting to nuts and bolts with pre-screening and transportation, reimbursement, and then this ongoing communication. CROs can draw from a huge patient database from other trials, and then with PPD through Synexus and other site partnerships, we have kind of a starting point with patients and potential patients to pull from. Our late phase group has done a lot of work in the patient preference space. The patient engagement work stream that I'm involved with at PPD, we've actually submitted comments to the public, the public dockets on some of the patient focused drug development new guidances. So we've done that as a group. I've also done that with National Medical Association. We've entered comments into some of the FDASIA public documents. So there's different ways to weigh in on an advocacy front. And then the kind of putting the data together from focus groups, patient partner interviews, and insight. Our Evidera research group does that and has a lot of publications on that front. We also have a group within Evidera that works to validate, and some have been really involved in some of the new patient-reported outcome tools. And we have a body of evidence that supports that pretty much across most therapeutic areas. I think the stock and trade for CROs is just the scientific and data-driven approach to finding the right patients, the access to the different databases and websites, healthcare information database, and all of that's used on, I think the iterative process kind of leads to our stock and trade and value for our different companies. With that, we have designed retention programs. I touched on that a little bit, but if you have a long-term follow-up post-study, how do you keep those patients in, or at least keep tabs on them so you can collect data 2 years down the road? And then working to always keep kind of the patient education value-driven proposition for patients and their families. So not just, again, recruiting for trials, but also engaging the patients around, valuable information around the disease state. So we have kind of a menu of different ways that we've worked. And depending, again, it's not one size fits all, but it depends on the therapeutic area, the goal of a particular study, but we have all of these tools that we've developed across a broad range of therapeutic areas and different types of clients and different phases of clinical development. As I mentioned, the virtual trial initiative, one of the platforms that we've looked at a lot of different platforms for e-health and using handhelds to engage patients, especially younger patients, around initial screening for trials, but also involving them throughout their trial experience, having flexible reimbursement options. So instead of sending them a gift card, they can, download the Cash App. Sometimes we use that, or some of the other more electronic ways of reimbursing them for travel. So these handheld and kind of app-driven technologies have really helped. Again, this not just helps the patient, but it also helps the site. It relieves the site of having to do all of this administrative kind of back office work themselves when it can be done electronically. One of the programs we're piloting is a patient concierge program. Giving patients, the goal is to give patients a single point of contact throughout the study, starting with recruitment and screening. Anything from travel support, reminders for appointments, medication, reimbursement. We initially modeled this in rare diseases, but we found that even non-rare, more common conditions, patients can benefit from this. And if it's especially in a space that's very competitive, maybe not a rare disease, but a disease state that has a lot of different competing trials, this can be a differentiator for the site as well as for the patient to choose, one trial over the other. So we've seen that, and we've kind of piloted and looked at it for something as common as overactive bladder. Patients, it's not a rare disease, but the patients are uncomfortable. There's a ton of overactive bladder studies. How can we make this model work without, again, making it budget incompatible? And when the patients are not as ill, it makes it a little bit easier because they're not requiring really involved, patient transport, but just these small supports and kind of an encouragement and point of contact for the life of the study, especially longer studies. So to sum up, through iterative process of working with all size pharma companies, small clients, device, different therapeutic areas. We've developed a really broad range of the ability to advise and involve patients, different ways to involve patients in study planning, understand and engage patients throughout the entire study, and then being able to apply kind of different lessons learned across the spectrum of diseases and phases and different types of study to leverage it for the next study that may not be an obvious fit. So I think that's kind of the stock and trade for CROs. We work with all types of clients across different therapy areas and different functional groups. And I think the CRO industry has really evolved to be more of a partner rather than kind of a turnkey vendor. And some of these technologies, I think, make that difference. So thank you for your attention.
So we'll open it now for questions from the audience.
I guess I'd also just like to make a comment that when we think of the voice of the patient, there's oftentimes a patient population that we don't think to include, and that's the pediatric patients. We also have to remember that oftentimes in the situation, it's not a patient disease, it's a family. And I learned this when I actually took a family, and Sonia, you might be aware of the Moss family. And we took them to Copenhagen because we wanted to educate the main company, but they were very clear that it's a family disorder. And so Evan was a patient with LGS, and he talked about his experience in writing a book and getting himself a seizure dog. The sister talked about the impact on her life, on what it's like, and then the parents talk. So I think when we bring in patients, we have to remember they're part of a community, they're part of a family that is affected by the disease. And we should listen to the pediatric patients. Oftentimes we talk about, we talk to the adult patients or we talk to the caregiver of pediatric patients, but we need to encourage bringing in the pediatric patients as well. That was my only comment.
Well, thank you. That was really wonderful to hear the spectrum of the different efforts across a variety of organizations to bring the patient into the process of new therapies. And I just sort of wanted to ask you as a group and individuals to participate in a brief thought experiment. So next week, you go back to work in your respective places, and you're thinking about this problem and the opportunities. If you had one opportunity to make a change and be able to implement it, which of course is a little bit of a fantasy that it would be that way, what would be the one thing you would do next in your setting to bring patients more effectively into the process? Where is the big limit?
Oh, okay. So I would say to make it part of our daily business, where we're not having separate conversations about it, where we are thinking about it from the beginning when we first have an idea, so that it's just part of how we do research, part of how we do regulatory efforts, part of how we do clinical care.
Yeah, I had the same thought of making it a partnership, but just not to echo and add something to that. I think that data transparency is so key, the return of results. When someone is in a trial, really thinking about what are the results you're going to give back. We brought up pediatric patients or caregivers. A lot of times they're in the trial and they know that they're not doing the trial for them. Like, it's probably going to be for the future generation. And so really respecting that and valuing that and being aware of that as you're thinking about the design and what you're giving back to them to say thank you.
Similarly is to include the conversation in every for me, it would be in every proposal, every protocol I touch and work on. It's like, where have we involved the patient? Do we need an advisory board to look at the protocol? Do we need a focus group of patients that have just completed the trial? Do we need to bring a few back in to see how their experience was? But to keep that conversation top of mind and almost as an agenda item. We have, background, project budget, all the normal components of a project, but make, patient, where's the patient? Or the patient is waiting. Where is that going to be on a regular, at every project?
My wish would be for more effective drugs. Nothing would make trials more appealing than to have truly effective drugs.
I think that's a great question. I think what I would probably do is, I think Sonia's point around what's the science is a really good question. And there's an assumption, I think, still in some industry arenas that this is the softer part of drug development, and this is something you fold in when you have a chance. And it's staggering to me that you can have so many academics in labs that never see a patient, and so many industry people that have never met somebody living with the disease burden trying to speculate on what's going to have clinically meaningful impact in the market. And the only way to get that information is from patients. So I think for us, it's working with the Citi data. Citi was mentioned earlier. Citi did a publication on the value of patient input in drug development. And it actually gives you measurable outcomes and measurable information around how to implement it and why it adds value. It's an important document. Our former CSO was one of the authors. And we actually use that a lot in talking to industry, because you have to be relevant and credible when you talk about why this is an important part of the work. I think for me, it would be to go back and to continue to talk to all of our industry partners around what we're bringing. When we talk about the entire family experience, when we talk about the patient experience, whether it's our congenital kids, our juvenile onset adults, and our older adults, we are talking to these people, providing support, working with these families, and seeing them all the time. And it's incredibly important that we understand how to deliver that information to industry in a way that ensures that they understand the value add of involving that piece in drug development.
So thank you guys for all of your work in this space. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the LGS Foundation, and I also have a daughter who's 26 who has LGS. My question is the more time I spend thinking about this, the more I see industry coming into the space and others, they will just bring a patient in, and it might not be the right patient. And it's not that you're not the right patient, it's just that, so I have a daughter with LGS, but she's verbal and she's not tube fed, but 30% of our population is tube fed and 70% of our patient population is nonverbal. And so now I'm trying to speak more to the data that we have about LGS when I go out, but how do you guys make sure you have the right patient? And then one step further, as we're educating the community about patient engagement, which is pretty much what I spend all my time on now, because I agree with you, it's just so incredibly important. How do we educate them about needing to find, we have a lot of data now about what the spectrum of the disease burden is and what the symptoms are, and even to a degree how different patient populations would prioritize them. So how do you educate sort of on that front? So somebody's getting pointed at.
I think that's where PFDD, for instance, was really helpful. So you get a patient-focused drug development meeting where you have several hundred people that are living with a disease, talking about disease burden from their perspective, and then talking about clinically meaningful benefit from their perspective. And it does cut across, this issue of heterogeneity and really variable symptom burden and all of that. So, and then you have a publication that's an FDA-targeted publication that industry finds credible, that has these different voices and has statistical, readout on here's the burden around GI versus the burden around myotonia versus the burden around CNS. So I think some of these tools that have been developed by FDA and others that help you gather a broader patient voice can actually be pretty helpful. And because they have credibility and they've been tested, people will actually rely on what's in them.
I'll just add that when we did our patient seminars, would always screen the patients. The one time I got burned, the one time I didn't, we had a patient who said some very inappropriate things, so the people in the audience were going, "Did she just say that?" So I learned my lesson the hard way, but I would get, I would ask either an advocacy group or one of the clinicians at the medical center for a typical patient, and then I would interview them to make sure they were, really going to educate the audience in the way that we wanted them to.
I struggle with that question too. I think especially with epilepsy or epilepsies, it's such a spectrum. And one of the other things that I struggle with is we think about digital tools and we think that this is going to be the new way we access people, but the reality is it's probably a female, it's probably white, it's probably someone who's super educated that's on that platform. And they're very activated and they're great and they're showcasing the spectrum, but they are not the full picture of the disease. I know that for the foundation, we're thinking about creative ways to create new creative community partners to get more access to the community to get to that question, because I do think that is a big issue, and I don't think that we've cracked the nut necessarily for that. And then again, that data transparency to then showcase this is the information that we found is going to be so key to that. We can't just collect the data. We have to think about how we're going to report it out and make sure that people have access to it.
So I would say that we've talked about the importance of when you've talked to one patient, you've talked to one patient with that condition. And we at FDA really do understand that, which is why we like the aggregated data. I know a lot of people have bristled sometimes about our request for that, but it's for a reason, because we do need to understand the patients across the entire spectrum. And to Sonia's point, the importance of creating those voices that are often omitted that may represent a significant portion of the patient community. We want to see efforts to garner that opinion. Now, when you're talking about patient advisors, there's two factors. It's skill set to be able to sit at the table, and we have championed the importance of educating patients so they can be empowered to sit at the table. There is no reason why we can't educate about clinical trial design, why we can't educate about outcomes so that they can make a meaningful contribution. But we also want a patient who has a lot of interactions with various patients. So they're not just reflecting their one experience, but they can give some insight into other people's experiences that they've shared with.
And I think, to your point about LGS, all diseases are heterogeneous. So going beyond being intentional about finding the different pockets of patients. And if there's no intention, it's not going to happen. So anytime you're convening a patient discussion, to all the other points, you have to be intentional. Do we have someone that's pediatric? Do we have someone that lives in a different country? Do we have all the age group? And it's work. And I think that's why it doesn't happen all the time. But you have to be, in my experience with convening that advisory board, it was about 100 hours more work than we had planned for, but it was so worthwhile. So we had to find translators. We had to dig through social media on a Polish site and keep clicking through. So it's work, but it's worthwhile to have patients of different age groups, different races, different parts of the country. If it's one country, it's work. So I think in understanding that it's work and planning for it, and not putting patient engagement in the smallest, least influential part of a company helps. But I think it has to be the intention has to be there, and it is critical.
We'll take one last question, and then we've got to go to the break before the next session starts.
Hopefully it's quick, and thanks for the nice presentation. I was wondering if these initiatives that you're working on have also been received in Europe in the same way that they're received by both the authorities and the people in the United States.
So is that a question to me or to others?
Whoever wants to answer.
Okay. I will yield the mic.
I've seen EMEA has a lot of, there's some joint initiatives with FDA patient voice, but they have a pretty well-developed kind of patient engagement platform as well. Not as much in some of the other regions, but Europe definitely is pretty on par.
definitive no. Well, nothing's approved.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
don't, so-
and there's a reason for that.
And then in terms of incorporating the voice, so for the My Seizure Gauge initiative, what's really nice is it's an international collaboration. So we have Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, as well as in the UK, Mark Richardson, and he's bringing in the Radar IMI initiative. And then in Australia, we have Seizure Medical and the Melbourne University. And all three sites are using user accessibility surveys. So the way that the initiative is set up is in the first year, we're testing out devices to understand not just comprehensive data, but also whether patients like the device to select that we're going to then use in year 2 to start doing the forecasting in. So this isn't driven from the government side, but it's something that we made a requirement for the initiative, and I think all 3 sites embraced it enthusiastically.
So I just want to make one take-home point from the perspective of the regulator. I think it's important for anyone who wants to develop studies on patient preference or patient-reported outcomes, if they intend for it to inform a regulatory process, that they talk to the regulators early. We've seen so many companies come through that have done the work, but it doesn't support the regulatory question. And so we really do, we have a pre-submission process that is completely free, but ask our advice early on. And so we do encourage that. And we work internationally with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So there's a lot of action happening there to create uniformity in how we regulate medical devices as well.
And we use the pre-submission process for our survey creation for We Prefer.
Thank you all very much.
Yes. Well, I want to thank our faculty here. I think it was very enlightening, and certainly I learned a lot today too. So thank you for all your